Thank you very, very much for spending the time with us today. My name is Theo Jebb.
I'm Philip Jebb.
And welcome to Post Wild. Today on the podcast, we have a very, very special guest. He is not only a preeminent botanist, he is the director of the National Botanic Gardens in Dublin, and most importantly to us, he is our dad. Welcome to the show, Dr. Matthew Jebb.
Great to be here. No, it's lovely.
Thank you very, very much, Dad.
Dad, you're the director of the National Botanic Gardens. Where did it all start for you? What got you into botany?
Gosh, you know, sometimes I look back on my time as a teenager, and I was an avid fossil collector. The thing that really, almost every holiday I spent with my parents, I'd make them go to a railway cutting or an old quarry or something, and I'd be collecting fossils, which I would then, identify. And that was at a period of history when you could go to the Natural History Museum in London with your little fossil collection, and somebody would come out from the back and they would put names on them. And it was very, very thrilling to the fact that these serious research scientists would actually give you a hand with naming what to them were probably pretty boring things, but nonetheless, it was part of their remit. And that, I found particularly thrilling. And I repaid them many years later by collecting a grapholite, a type of fossil in the mountains of Indonesian New Guinea. And I sent it to them, and they were excited because they had no other fossils from that area. So it was quite a thrill for them. But why did I turn from fossils to botany? I think that was probably fostered more than anything else by the summer holidays I spent on Lambay. As a child, from my earliest years, we would spend 6 to 8 weeks of our summer holiday on Lambay, and a great deal of time I spent down on the beach. Even as quite a young boy, I was allowed to roam freely on the beach, catch things in rock pools. There were bigger boys who lived on the island who, showed me how to catch all these little sticklebacks. Were sticklebacks in some of the ponds, which always I found amazing because these were freshwater fish and they were out on an island in saltwater pools. But that is the case, that they do indeed live in places like that. But it was the excitement of rock pools was that you had a complete microcosm of plants and animals, almost sort of everything from shrimps and crabs, hermit crabs, fish, to little planktonic animals that had got trapped. There's jellyfish offshore. There was a huge amount of thrilling natural history to sort of really get my teeth into. So I was fascinated by biology in general. And amongst the books on Lambay was Rachel Carson's trilogy of books on the sea. So she was a marine biologist working in North America, and she wrote a series of 3 books. One was about the sort of physical oceanography, currents and so on, but the others were on the wildlife, the fish, the birds, everything related to the sea. And they were written in the sort of first person. She always described, a sort of, say, a marlin or something chasing other fish. And it was all done from the point of view of the marlin. So you were very much immersed in nature. And it was, it wasn't whimsical. It was very scientific, but hugely educational. And I could, equate all those things to sort of getting up in the morning and being down on the seashore. The weather was always either windy, sunny, but it was, all of those seasons were packed into an Irish summer. And it became a very, all-embracing and immersive experience. So that certainly got me into biology. And the reason I got into botany was essentially the day I was applying for university. We were filling in our forms, and the careers teacher, I took it up, and he said, "Why have you put down botany?" I said, "Well, yeah, I'm quite interested in botany." He said, No, we've spoken about this, and fill it in again and put geology. But I held my ground. I don't know quite why, because I would have been 17, 18. So it was sort of brave to stand up against a career teacher. I said, no, I really, honestly, I want to do botany. And the reason for that was probably down to a teacher, Peter Freeland, who was the biology master at my school, was fascinated by plants. It was very clear that looking back on it, he gave me a better grounding in botany that the vast majority of biology teachers do, because animals are more exciting. They are they're moving, they have lives, they
Emotional.
feed, and so people watch David Attenborough films and so on, and it's the animals that they think of as wildlife. Wildlife really becomes animals only. But Peter took us out onto grass fields and showed us how to identify different grasses just by their leaves alone in these little quadrats. It's a sort of meter square. You lay it on a lawn and you can count up how many species of plant are present. And this is something that other people never get to experience until they're well into university degrees. So by the time I got to university, I thought, wow, I know all these things. And it became, a very thrilling topic. And at university, I was at Oxford University reading botany. There was a huge emphasis on tropical botany. A lot of people involved in research at the botany department had been to Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, collecting, naming new species of plant. And so, by the time I got to the end of my degree, I just sort of shifted over into doing a PhD on a extraordinary group of plants in New Guinea called ant plants. They're plants that have a huge, massive tuber. So they grow on trees. They're epiphytic. They hang off trees. They're not parasitic on the tree. They just use their roots to hold on. But they grow this enormous tuber in their stem, which is full of cavities, which are inhabited by an ant colony. So as a symbiosis, it was a very thrilling group of plants, because I was always fascinated by carnivorous plants that's very obvious that there's an animal interaction. It's not just a plant on its own. Straight away you see this interaction with a group of animals, and in this case it was ants, and they were an amazing group to work upon. And I ended up in my PhD describing many, many new species. I went on trips to Papua New Guinea, Fiji, to Irian Jaya, which is now the Papua province of Indonesia, collecting these plants in many times in areas that nobody had collected these plants in before. So I was endlessly coming upon brand new species that had not got a scientific name. Incredibly, of course, they had local names. The people who had lived there for tens of thousands of years had named these plants, but in many cases they simply used them as target practice. They threw toy spears into them and so on. But they, that experience of visiting people living very remotely, subsistence farmers, surrounded by this manifestation of tropical botany, which is sort of big and fundamentally more exciting than temperate botany, but it gives you a grounding and a sort of basis to come back and appreciate your own sort of Irish flora, for example, in this case, much better. You sort of have these insights. Yes, it's small, maybe it's less thrilling and exciting as a symbiosis, but nonetheless there is an excitement, a thrill to botany that I have always hugely appreciated.
Fantastic. That's so interesting. And could you bring us back then to when you first started university and you were thinking of places to go? What drew you to New Guinea? What was it about New Guinea?
Well, again, like all of these things in life, it was serendipitous, but it was National Geographic magazines. Reading National Geographic when I was a young lad, that would come monthly, and that glossy magazine, it was so rich, the colours. It was that photographic, because before digital photography, Kodachrome was so rich in the reds. They were just beautiful photographs. So there were a lot of articles about people around the world, cultures, but also extraordinary animals and plants. And I remember these issues on things like Nepenthes, these pitcher plants in New Guinea, and the excitement of reading about them, the colours, the extraordinary behavior of a plant able to, capture insects in these water-filled, modified leaves, I did find just so enthralling. So, when we were at Oxford, we were all encouraged to consider organising expeditions to anywhere in the world. It could be from the Arctic, the Antarctic, anywhere in the tropics. So we amongst a few friends, we said, well, where's the most remote place? Where will we never go? Yeah, and it was obvious from National Geographic, New Guinea was the place to go. It was, well, we now know it's got 1,300 languages. 1/4 of the Earth's living languages are found on the island of New Guinea. It's a truly extraordinary place. So we said, well, we're never going to go on a holiday to New Guinea, so let us organize our expedition to go there. And it was, again, very fortunate that the place we planned to go, I was talking to a researcher in the gardens, and she explained to me that, yes, she had worked and collected these plants in the past, but all the big German expeditions that had gone to what was once German New Guinea, all of their specimens housed in Berlin were destroyed during the Second World War. So they were burnt by incendiary bombs. And so there were plants that have been named from collections in New Guinea from the 1890s, very early years of the 20th century as well. The descriptions are still there, but the specimen upon which that species is described, which we call the type specimen, they had all been burnt. And on our trip, on our expedition, we were students, we weren't well versed in taxonomy, but we just so happened to recollect half a dozen of these lost type specimens, and bringing them back, she was blown away. She said, wow, you have got, Myrmecodia schlechteri. It's a species we know in the literature, but we have no specimen of it. And here you've got specimens from essentially where that German expedition entered the Bismarck Mountains. So those were formative months that we spent in New Guinea. Really very, very exciting to be exploring a country which is well mapped. It's filled with people. So, you can travel to places, you can find housing, you can get fed, but the botany, the flora is virtually unknown.
Fantastic. And Dad, I was very fortunate to be born in New Guinea along with our two older brothers. What was it like setting out with Mum, moving to New Guinea after getting married and setting up a family in the tropics?
Well, I mean, the extraordinary thing is, I was offered that job the day before we got married. So 1 month after we were married, off we went to New Guinea, and we lived there for nearly 6 years. And that was both a wonderful start to our own marriage, that, we were away from family and friends. We were just going to start our own life in our own way. It was extremely thrilling. I was running a research station funded by the Christensen Fund from California. They had a research station that was, it shared a little peninsula with a diving resort. And that was the purpose. The purpose was that the dive resort had all the air cylinders, the boats, the equipment, a dive shop, and therefore all the marine biologists working at the station could be easily sort of accommodated and looked after. But we were also within, 30 minutes drive of absolutely virgin rainforest, forest that has never been felled. It had been the scene of incredible fighting between the Japanese and the American forces during the Second World War. But one of the consequences of that is a lot of the coastal forests are filled with shrapnel. So they can never be felled because there is literally shrapnel embedded in these tree trunks from, 70 years earlier. So a lot of the forest had been deliberately ignored and left. But each valley you went into, as you explored it, it was filled again with plants, sometimes described historically, but many were the first time they were ever been collected. Was with local people who had names for them, but they were not part of the scientific literature. They had not got a scientific name. So, collecting those plants over the years was very thrilling. That many of these trees, big trees, right in the village, nobody had given it a name because historically people would say, "Well, we're going into the rainforest and we're going to head up to the virgin forest," but actually people are growing fruit trees in villages. And strangely, nobody had bothered to collect them because they said, well, they're just fruit trees in the village and maybe they're widespread. But no, some of them had come from the forest and they were deliberately growing them locally. So yeah, one's got to be very careful not to look, but not actually see and understand that these things are extraordinarily exciting. That when you're in a country like that, the levels of support for science and so on is so small when development is more significant. There are things, everyday things, that are novel.
How do you go about naming a plant that has a local name already?
Well, yes, it's an interesting point, because what we do in science, when we name a new animal or plant, you've got to get a specimen of it first. Then you've got to demonstrate it is different from every other sort of related species. And we do that by a system of classification which Carl Linnaeus set up in the 18th century, which is essentially that we put everything into genera. And a genus is like a sort of family name. So in the case of a daisy, for example, the genus is Bellis. And then we give it a sort of nickname, what we call the specific epithet, which is the second part of a scientific name. So for a daisy, it's perennis, meaning perennial. It lives year after year. So Bellis perennis is a daisy. So when we collect a new species of ant plant or pitcher plant, the first thing we do is say, right, well, it is part of this genus. So now I need to look at all the other related species and see, is it distinguishable, or is it part of a variation in a species? Because some species are very variable. Other species are very, very tight, but most species have got local variants. So you have to be careful. You've got to be quite thorough in your researches, examining these things. Having decided, right, we've got a different species growing here, you must have an example of it. And essentially, you've collected and pressed a dried specimen. Sometimes in a difficult, remote place, in the middle of a rainstorm, you've collected a plant, you've pressed it, you've got to keep it dry, you've got to dry it out without it going moldy. So there are a lot of challenges in the tropics, especially with field collecting. Then that specimen, we refer to it as the type specimen. When we describe it, we could talk about what it looks like in the wild, but we want to measure the leaves. We want to measure the flowers, look at the pollen grains, the anthers, all the little pieces of the structures of the plant that distinguishes it from other species. And then we come to a point where we coin a name. So we say, right, this is a new species. What am I going to call it? And you might call it, that it's red-leafed, or it's got blue flowers. So these are sort of easy descriptors. In other cases, I used a lot of Pidgin English words. So one of the ant plants I call Hydnophytum highlands. Highlands was their reference to the highlands of Papua New Guinea. It's spelt in a very specific way. Melanesian Pidgin is, a very well-documented language. It might be a Pidgin language, Pidgin English, but nonetheless, it had approved spellings. So Hydnophytum highlands became a wonderful way to call it, because it was found throughout the highlands, for example. One could also use very local names. So in Fiji, I named an ant plant Squamalaria theketheke, which means testicles, because that's what they called them, testicles of the trees, these big rounded tubers hanging on the trees. It was a nickname, a local name. So yes, it was an amusing thing to call it. The other species had been named after sort of European collectors, or one was called Major because it was big. So, I would always, because I was always curious, what do you call this plant? I do remember on one occasion, I was asking the two local men I was with, what do you call this plant? And he said, oh, yes. He said, so he turned to the two collectors who I'd been walking with, and he said, that means man's head, doesn't it, in their local language? And they said, yes. So he said to me, that translates as man's head. And when they said it to him, man's head, he said, yep, that's man's head in the local language. They all went, yes, so it is. And the same applies to us here in Ireland. I'll often say to people, do you know why a daisy is called a daisy? And they'll say, no, they're daisies. Yeah, well, it's actually day's eye. And when you sort of hear day's eye. You go, oh yeah, I can see that. It's a little eye of the day, a little yellow sun with rays coming out of it. So even us Europeans, we have given ridiculous English, French, German, whatever language, we've given sometimes slightly ridiculous names. I mean, the great example is a blackbird. I mean, it is such a banal name. Yes, it's a blackbird, but it's got a beautiful golden orange beak and a wonderful orange circle around its eyes. It's glossy black, female, quite different in her brown plumage. And on the face of it, blackbird seems quite a sort of bland name to have given to it.
Absolutely.
That is fantastic, Dad. And would you be able to bring us back to the influence of Charles Darwin and the origin of species in terms of your thought process and your scientific understanding and how important Darwinism is to your concepts?
I suppose, as any schoolboy learning biology, we heard about Charles Darwin and his theory of natural selection. So, his book, The Origin of Species, is all about how natural selection would work. Until Darwin's day, biologists didn't recognize how species might alter. So some biologists thought, no, species are immutable, i.e. they haven't changed. But others would say, no, we look in the fossil record and we can see this vast array of trilobites and ammonites and mammoths and dinosaurs. They're not around today. Sometimes very similar things. You could see gigantic armadillos from the past, 2 meters long, from South America, which Charles Darwin actually collected on a beach there. And it was while he was, in the evenings, they were camping out with these gauchos, who are South American cowboys. They were looking after cattle, but they had come out, they were the camp supporters for Darwin's excavation of these huge extinct animals. He suddenly saw, because they were eating armadillo, he thought, gosh, yeah, I can recognize this bone from the armadillo from the huge fossils I've excavated, but they are 5 or 6 times the size. That was Glyptodon, this extraordinary extinct armadillo.
And he was excavating a full skeleton.
He was, well, all
big
these
barrels of them.
Yeah, there were all these bones washing out of a cliff, and he was amassing them to send back. His first sort of real love was geology, so there's a certain parallel there, that he went on that trip around the world as a naturalist, but also geology was his particular sort of graw. It was the topic that he loved more than anything else, because it was very physical and straightforward. And once you've identified a type of rock and you can understand how strata sits, all of which was very novel in his day. The books, the work going on in Cambridge was very sort of up to date. It was the first time again in history that people had a good understanding of how ancient the world was. It wasn't just young, a few thousand years old. It was millions of.
But they were still eluded by tectonic plates completely, weren't they?
Yeah, but nobody understood, that tectonic plates were moving at that time. That wasn't until literally the 1940s that people finally felt, the geologists finally felt safe in saying, yeah, the continents are moving very slowly, but they were still worried that what was the mechanism of their movements. But it is that comparative thing that triggered Darwin's ideas, that here was an organic link. And it wasn't until many years later, it's while I was doing my PhD, that I read The Origin of Species from cover to cover. And I was astonished at, again, how easily readable it is. I would say a 12-year-old child fascinated by natural history should be encouraged to read The Origin of Species, because it lays out each chapter in very logical, easy to read language, nothing technical or complicated about it, his thoughts and ideas of why species are evolving. So we had all the evidence from the fossil history, but again, it was a mechanism. You needed a mechanism, and natural selection was the mechanism that he was able to support with endless examples. He had gathered over 25 years. He had been gathering this information. The reason he finally published that book, which he always regarded as a summary, like a little abstract of his whole life's work, was receiving a letter from Alfred Wallace in They come from all the way from modern day Indonesia, what was then the Dutch East Indies. Wallace had written a paper there, essentially encapsulating Darwin's very ideas about natural selection. So he was devastated. He thought, oh my goodness, I've been pipped to the post here. And in science, it's very important, your priority of publication. And his friends rallied around. They said, no, you've been working on this 25 years. What we will do is when Wallace's paper is read at the Linnean Society, your paper will also be read, a summary of your work. And within a year, he had The Origin of Species written and published. And it went through many, many, many editions, even in his lifetime. People like, Huxley, one of the famous zoologists of the time, said, how extremely stupid not to have thought of it oneself, that it was self-evident how natural selection...
I thought Huxley was very anti it, was he not?
No, Huxley was referred to as Darwin's bulldog.
Oh, sorry, not Huxley. Who's the other anti?
Owen,
sorry. Yeah, Huxley was Darwin's bulldog.
You can
sorry.
do that again if you want. No. Cut that out.
No, that's fantastic.
Well, yeah, I mean, Huxley famously was referred to as Darwin's bulldog. He defended Darwin to a famous bishop, Wilberforce, who had, called attended this public debate in Oxford, and famously, asked Huxley, is it from your mother's side or your father's side that you're descended from a monkey? And he was delighted with that. He stood up and he said, this is exactly your problem, not to understand and use your intellect.
The other fascinating thing about Darwinism and the Darwin school of thought is the fact that it should incorporate us more into nature, in terms of it very clearly says that we are part of biodiversity, we are constantly evolving, we are part of the living nature, and yet still over 200 years after that idea is in society, we're still slightly at odds with that in the bigger systems picture, are we not? In terms of it's still there's a separation of us and nature that I think that we need to kind of reconnect to, realizing through Darwinism that we are so part of nature.
An interesting phenomenon in sort of popular science is the sheer number of books now written which take a almost sort of liberal socialist point of view that nature is benevolent and somehow works together. The brutal truth is the struggle for existence that Darwin spoke about is that even within a species, the most ferocious selection pressure is from the members of your own species. Other foxgloves are the biggest enemy of foxgloves. It's not that they hate each other, it is that they need the same set of nutrients from the soil, they need the same pollinators. So essentially what natural selection is doing is favouring the ones that are most efficient at competing with the neighbouring plants, most efficient at attracting pollinators, because they will have more offspring, more progeny in the next season. So they will start to dominate the population. And those individuals who are less capable are literally exterminated from the gene pool. So it is a ferocious thing, natural selection. It means that, one of the first principles of Darwin's theory is the population growth, that every species of animal or plant on this planet will go through exponential growth. And he cited Carl Linnaeus, because Linnaeus said, well, if you had an annual plant and it had 2 seeds, which is an incredibly small number of seeds to set, and those 2 seeds grew the next year and each of them produced 2, you would have 2, 4, 8, and in 20 years' time, you've got 1 million offspring. You think, whoa, yeah, that's pretty impressive for something that is reproducing so slowly. And Darwin gave an example of elephants, and he explained that an elephant's not going to start breeding till it's well over 20, 25 years old. And up until the age of 60 or 70, it might produce 6 offspring. And you say, gosh, that's a slow rate of change, that in hundreds of years there'll just be 1,000 elephants. But in 500, 600 years, that is 13 million offspring. So, there are only a few, well, now there's probably 500,000 elephants left in Africa, but at their height, there was probably 4 or 5 million elephants in Africa. So even in 500 years, a very slow breeding species will start to, produce itself in prodigious numbers. But it doesn't. Every year there are the same number of blackbirds and missel thrushes and daisies in Ireland. It's limited. Ireland is only the size it is. It's not getting bigger itself. So there's only so much space for all these things. So the number of offspring that die without producing offspring themselves is enormous. And the ones that do succeed are the ones that are more capable than others around them of producing more offspring. So that is the basis of natural selection. And it gives any biologist enormous predictive sort of insights into explaining, well, how have these things come about? Why have we got this beautiful symbiosis or pollinator that absolutely fits the plant it's pollinating? And one school of thought at the time was, well, they were created, So Paulian people said, if you walked across a ploughed field and you picked up a watch, there had to be a watchmaker. There's no way that this had formed by chance in nature, all these little gears and cogs and springs. But that is what natural selection does. It produces something that is unmistakable for something that's been designed.
Well, you'd look at the ants and their tuber in the tree, and that's been designed.
Yeah, exactly.
Slowly formed.
Exactly. So actually, that's the exact point. So these symbiotic relationships almost seem, as you say, it seems like there must be this watchmaker designing it. But as you've also said, what's so amazing about the origin of species is it brings this down to a level that we can slightly understand. And there is ways of, it's like we can't recreate a model of the sky with Lego blocks, but we can use Lego blocks to try and recreate a model of the sky, on a table. So the point is, if we're playing with Lego blocks, how do we how do we simplify that mechanism down?
I suppose this goes back to your question at the beginning, which is, why do we not, us humans in general, why do we sort of ignore nature? And I suppose the tangent I went off there is that, natural selection is ferocious. It's essentially selfish. And Richard Dawkins wrote this famous book, The Selfish Gene, which I would have, serious disagreements with his view that the gene is the unit of selection. It's the individual that is selected, not the gene. But it gives the appearance, just in the same way we think something's been designed, it would appear that the genes themselves are selfish. But everything in nature, every tree and individual ant and, an ant would be a bad example, but individual species that don't live as colonial animals, they are doing their utmost to outcompete their neighbours. Colonial animals, ants and so on, Darwin was fascinated by that here was a group of, honeybees or ants cooperating with just one queen. She is the egg layer. So she is a bit like just the gonads of another multicellular organism. It's like she is the breeding part and they are there to look after her, what may.
They're some of the most successful animals in the world. Termites and ants and bees.
Yes, one of the extraordinary things about those colonial things is they have very funny genetics. So, a male honeybee, he has just half the chromosome number of the queen and all the workers. So incredibly, the workers share between themselves 75% of their genes. Now, in every other biological organism, which, both parents are what we call diploid, they've both got the sets of chromosomes. The offspring only share 50% of their genes with their mother and 50% with their father. But honeybees share 75% with one another, which is quite extraordinary because they get 100% of their genes from their father's sperm. So that the drone that mated with the queen, all of his genetic material goes to the offspring. But we have found in bees now, using DNA in a hive, you can work out that queen will have mated with 30, 40, in extreme cases up to 80 drones over a period of 3 or 4 days when she was a virgin queen and she set off. She mated with a vast number of drones. This insight is all based upon DNA sequencing of individual workers, and it was extraordinary because previously people thought, oh, she flew off and she mated with one drone and that was it, and it is not the case. A single drone could supply enough sperm to that queen in that one mating for her to go on laying eggs for 3 to 4 years, but she throws much of it away, just retains a tiny amount and goes on mating with endless males, and just randomly that sperm will fertilize the eggs. So some workers they share a father and some don't, and they're referred to as super sisters within a hive. So some workers are more closely related than they are to other workers in the hive, and it is so much has been revealed about this just through DNA work. And when a colony decides they're going to replace the queen makes no decisions. She's not like a human ruler and in deciding who the heir is going to be. The workers amongst themselves with their tiny little brains come to a conclusion she needs to be replaced. Her egg-laying days are numbered, so they produce new queens and they protect them in these extraordinary queen cells they build. They feed them lots of royal jelly, and that turns what would be a worker into an egg-laying queen. And when they do this, it's not like the super sisters say, we're going to produce our queen from our offspring. Incredibly, they pick the rarest of the eggs. It's as though they've got an insight into the genetics of all these little larvae, and they say, right, this is one of the rarest genotypes, and we're going to raise these as new queens, which is extraordinary. But it's explicable by natural selection, because if a hive decided we're going to, each of the super sister groups, we're going to raise our queen, there would be a terrible battle. It would be a big disadvantage to the hive. And essentially, once you've got a disadvantage like that of sort of infighting, what happens to those colonies is they do not do well. They don't prosper. So natural selection has brought about this ability of the workers to recognize we're not going to fight about this, and they don't, because if they did, those lineages of bees probably have disappeared.
Amazing. Yeah.
The predictive power of natural history is extraordinary, and you go back to the writings of Aristotle, and he recognized that bees were faithful to flowers. So when a honeybee comes out of the hive, she visits, say, a dandelion. She will then visit a dandelion and a dandelion. She will never waver from that. But if she came out of the hive and she visited a daisy, thereafter she just visits daisies. So this faithfulness to flowers on each flight, the next flight they might hear from other bees, and literally they hear it in this waggle dance. There's a buzzing going on in the hive, and they can feel vibrations. The movement of one worker is saying, I have found a patch of plants and they are 300 meters northeast of here, and keep the sun to your right as you're flying to them. And this is precisely what they do. They're able to convey in the hive precisely where this patch of nectar is. So they go off, and it might be a field of flax or something, little blue flowers, and the bees are feeding there. They're bringing back the nectar, but they will not sort of say, oh, there's a woundwort or a hawthorn tree, and I'll just pop in and grab some nectar. They're very faithful. Aristotle saw this, and we know it's true. How has that evolved? How has a tiny little honeybee brain got this idea that it's got to be faithful? And the answer is incredibly simple, because you say, right, well, imagine a hive where bees are not faithful to the flowers. So they go out and they visit a thistle, and they say, oh, there's a dandelion, and then a daisy, and then a hawthorn tree. What will be the seed set in that area the following year? And the answer is, well, it'll be quite poor, because things aren't being pollinated like for like. The pollen is going to a completely different flower, and therefore no seeds are being produced. So essentially the seed crop around that hive is exceptionally poor, and therefore the nectar next season will be in thin supply. So you can see, right, well, natural selection will tend to favor hives where faithfulness has evolved.
Superstition.
So it's extraordinary, yeah, and it's just there. And once you've got that predictive power of natural selection, you can understand why the world is just so full of species of birds and flowering plants, big successful groups of organisms. And that would include, solitary bees. There's over 100 species of solitary bee living in Ireland. They are all tuned to incredible efficiency, even though some of them are very scarce and rare.
So to simplify I think even a more visceral example than elephants and 2 seeds a year is puffballs. So
Yes.
if you explain that story, I think that's more mind blowing to explain if every bit of nature succeeds, it's not a good thing.
And if you can picture a puffball, those people who have seen a puffball, it's an extraordinary fungus, a huge white ball, bigger than a soccer ball. They sometimes smaller, but within a few days of forming this big white meaty flesh, the entirety of its center turns into a fibrous network full of spores, literally billions of spores. And when that's hit by rain or knocked about, this whole puffball, it erupts and tears open, and these spores are released to the atmosphere, and they can blow literally around the globe. If every one of those spores produced a mycelium big enough to produce a puffball in turn, they far exceed the volume of the planet in just a single generation. And fungi are very interesting. I think people imagine a fungus in a tree or in the ground as getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the mycelium growing larger and larger. It doesn't actually. It penetrates the soil, but it's always dying back at its sort of old mycelium disappears. So there's this huge turnover going on in the soil. It's not like there's a big benevolent mycelium sitting in the soil that is forming these symbiotic relationships with plants that we call mycorrhizal association. They are constantly turning over. And nature is never standing still. It is in constant turmoil and movement.
Fantastic. And then the other thing, Dad, is in terms of parallel thought, it's interesting talking about plate tectonics and evolution, and just hearing those two concepts together it's an interesting thing that there's a lot of hidden mechanisms of changes that we can't see. It happens in astrophysics, it happens in biology, it happens in geology. What I think is very interesting, and we have a lot of concepts now, things like shifting baseline syndrome, which has been around in the psychology movement in shifting goalposts almost 2 decades before it's now in the biology movement in marine biology, specifically in the 90s. But I think the story of Darwin and Malthusian economics, I think probably best describes that. So could you explain what that connection there is?
Yeah, so Malthus's writings were essentially about the production of human populations. He spoke about the idea that human populations, if they had enough food, would get bigger and bigger and bigger, but they don't, because disease, malnutrition will restrict populations. And he also saw the success of a particular business or commercial retailer, somebody selling shoes, for example. If they sold cheaper and better shoes than the neighboring shops, people would visit that shop more, and it would increase in trade, and it would become a bigger entity. And this was a theory that, of course, is almost in parallel to natural selection, and it's what really triggered Darwin. He said, at last I have a theory to work towards, this understanding of exponential increase in numbers, but limited resources, but also the fact that certain enterprises that were more successful than their neighboring enterprises would always do better because more customers would go to them. And so that is those two sort of ideas, which are simple human economic theories, is what enabled Darwin to really hang all of the observations, things that he had heard from other people, ideas, thoughts, concepts. He could see, right, I can hang them on this theory. And that's how we work in science. We can come up with a little theory and then we apply the facts to it. And if it all stays together, it's fine. When a fact doesn't support it, this is part of the growth of saying, right, we need to adjust our theory and change it.
Fantastic. And then you were talking about it earlier, Dan, but just to touch on it again, the complexities of a symbiotic relationship can seem like there must be some sort of a designer behind it. Because, for example, there's stories of the life cycle of a moth where the caterpillar's designed to be camouflaged a certain way, and then as a heather plant changes through the season, the next stage of the caterpillar is evolved to look like that, and then the final version of the caterpillar has the moth that arrives out of it has eyes on its wings. And you think for each of those little steps and all the problems and mistakes to have been made, it almost doesn't make sense. But to simplify that back down, and again, I think dog breeds is probably the best way for someone to contextualize this. How can we explain natural selection in a slightly simpler form? Because all of that stuff is so amazingly magnificent, but you almost need a level of literacy in biology to be able to fathom that. And I don't have that level of literacy. I look at many moths and I think, this is almost too complex. This is almost preposterous. So for the less literate people like me in biology, how would you explain evolution and natural selection in a slightly simpler version again?
Yeah, so we've spoken already about exponential increase in populations and also limited resources. And this led to the first conclusion that Darwin said. He said, there's enormous numbers of offspring, there's a limited resources, and from year to year, it's a steady state. We see the same population of, orchids or nettles or, sea holly growing on the beach. It's not like some years you get vast quantities. So there's a steady state in nature of populations. So he said, well, there must be a struggle because so many offspring have not survived. So many of those seeds have not produced an adult plant. There's an enormous struggle for existence. And then he coupled that with his endless discussions with breeders, farmers. He spoke to a lot of farmers about their cattle. He'd go to farmers' marts and talk about sheep breeds and pigs and cattle. He also took up the hobby of keeping pigeons, fancy pigeons. So pigeon breeders are producing these extraordinary breeds called sort of tumblers and fantails and pouters. And he could see this variation that a breeder would say, now this is the perfect Tamworth pig, and I'm going to cross this boar with this sow because they both show wonderful characteristics that I want in the breed. This was artificial selection. It was human contained breeding of whether it's racehorses or rabbits or doves, or it's cabbages or peas and beans. You're making cultivars of plants or breeds of animals. So this artificial selection is essentially what gave him the notion of natural selection. So it is obvious that these breeders are making Great Danes. Two Great Danes produce baby Great Danes. They don't produce baby Chihuahuas just suddenly like that. It's careful selection by human beings who are essentially behaving as though this is natural history, confining a species. So, he gave the example in Origin of Species of cats. Some cats love catching baby rabbits, some mice, others rats, and they sort of specialize. And strangely, their kittens, for example, would, because they're always being fed rats, they sort of learn from their parents, well, we hunt rats. And if the conditions were such that, the species of or varieties of cats were separated and they only had mice and they only have rats, then they would evolve to become more proficient on that group. And he compared this to wolves, that in some parts of the ranges, very long-legged wolves were excellent at chasing deer. They could, race down reindeer or caribou in North America, whereas there were often shorter-legged wolves in populations that specialized on sheep which are much slower. So again, if circumstances meant that these two populations were segregated and their prey stayed the same, deer and sheep, they would eventually evolve to be so different that they would mutually not recognize or interbreed with one another. And this has been proven time and time again, most intriguingly on the Galapagos Islands, where people have looked at the sizes of finches' beaks, because that was something that when Darwin collected in Galapagos, he failed to carefully annotate his collection. He shot all these birds, but he just said collect in the Galapagos Islands. But it was very clear he'd collected a dozen different species, and they were all named. But modern researchers have gone to islands, and year after year they have trapped finches, measured their beaks and size and appearance, and they have seen in drought years the beaks evolving very rapidly to make sure they could feed on particular seeds. That these are plants that were surviving in the drought, whereas other plants disappeared in the droughts, and therefore those finches whose beak was only adapted to those seeds died out. And then the drought would break and the beak size would change again in the population. So you could see evolution in action, and it doesn't go in one direction, it goes to and fro. And there's a wonderful theory referred to as the Red Queen hypothesis, based on Lewis Carroll's books on the Through the Looking Glass, that Alice would be talking to the Red Queen, who was running on the spot. And she said, "Why are you running so fast?" She said, "Well, don't you know, you have to run this fast to stay in the same place." And that is precisely what's happening in biology, that this variation, just this little tiny differences appear in all offspring. Nobody looks identical, in the same way that if you look close enough, no daisy plant is identical to another daisy plant. They're all the product of sexual recombination, so they're slightly different, hairier, taller, redder petals, things like that. And if circumstances are such that one particular form is favoured, the species will constantly be altering. The difficulty is understanding, well, when does a species split into two? And that is, I suppose, one of the more thrilling bits of biology.
This is the first, but definitely not the last time we're going to have Dad on it. Dad, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on, discussing your enthusiasm for all things living and unliving. I had a fantastic teacher in school who taught me a very important lesson, that nothing we do in this life is original. And I think it's very interesting for people to see where our enthusiasm comes from. The apple did not fall far from the tree. So Dad, thank you very much for inspiring us with your
Just
enthusiasm.
scratching the surface.
Sharing some of that enthusiasm with the viewers.
No, a pleasure. I love talking about it, because I do feel, it is important to enthuse people throughout the population, because nature faces a crisis, and the more people empathise and understand it, the more valuable that is. Under the flight path of a busy airport lies an isolated and out-of-the-way coastline. In sight of the Poolbeg chimneys of Dublin, the litter of humanity may be strewn upon the beaches, but these shallow coves, washed by the deep blue waters of the Irish Sea, lie all but undisturbed. Overlooked by the lichen-spattered rocks of the highest tide, newborn Atlantic grey seal pups are warmed by the low October sun. The mothers hang in the shallows, squabbling and snarling over their positions in the surf. Getting caught out in an autumnal squall can be dangerous. But these young animals are hardier than they look.
Their soft white coats are an evolutionary throwback to a time when they started life on the frozen sea ice during the last ice age. These white coats remain as a testament to the unplanned raw processes of evolution and slow, perpetual climate change. The mothers only return to feed them for short spells, leaving them for many hours at a time. After several weeks of feeding every few hours, the pups balloon in size, quadrupling their body weight and molting into their adult coats. The white fluff falling away reveals the dense fur that will keep them warm, even in frozen seas. It is at this time of year that the males fight for dominance over stretches of coastline, inflicting bites and scars as they battle to father next year's pups. All of this goes on as it has done for thousands of years. Now a glimpse from an aeroplane window, in earshot of more than 1 million people, amongst the flotsam of a city.